J'ai la joie d'accueillir aujourd'hui un jeune chercheur anglais, James Whittington. I'll switch to English to introduce James. James is both a medical doctor, a neuroscientist, and a mathematician. And a physicist, in fact, by training, as I learned, but with a strong mathematical orientation, if I may say. And he got his PhD with Tim Behrens and Rafal Bogash, who are remarkable researchers trying precisely to bridge the gap between neuroscientific observations and theory, mathematical theory. And so this attracted my attention already some years ago. They were able to develop remarkable models of how the brain develops geometrical representations. I think you all know about place cells and great cells, but if you don't, I think you will introduce them. And we will see that it's possible to capture very simple mathematical principles that allow the brain to develop these cell assemblies. I think this is a general topic of your work. I don't want to say anything more. Thank you so much for traveling across the channel for us last night, and your talk, How to Build Cognitive Maps. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So a word of warning, it's not really a word of warning, but there will be, we saw the brilliant talk earlier. This one will have a somewhat, slightly more technical feel to it. I will try to keep things as high level as possible and as understandable as possible, but just there will be an element more technical details. So a word of warning there. But thank you very much for having me here. And we're going to be talking about how to build cognitive maps. So the first question is, what is a cognitive map? I'm going to try to tell you now that what a cognitive map is an internal model like we heard in the previous talk, and it's what allows us to perform some flexible behavior. So what do I mean by that? Well, here's a rodent, and it's learned that in order to get reward, it needs to run around this wall. And it can do that over and over and over again. But what happens if a new shortcut appears, a new opening appears? Well, now, repeating these old actions is no longer optimal, because now it will just run into the wall. And instead, taking this shortcut is the appropriate action to take. But that's something this rodent can only know that it needs to do if it knows that this location here connects to this location here. And that's really what I mean by an internal model. It needs to have this internal map in its head of how things in the world connect and relate to each other. And so the question for us neuroscientists then is, how is it that the brain is doing this? How does the brain form these maps in the mind using substrate of neurons? And so that's the question we're going to ask here. So we're fortunate that there's been lots and lots of recordings over the last few decades of neurons, of animals performing these sorts of tasks, doing inferences in space. So what we're seeing here is the top-down view of a square box, and the black trajectory is everywhere that this animal has run. So it's run around, run, squiggle, 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 a bit like the drawings we saw earlier. And we can see every time that there is a red dot, that is when one particular cell has fired. So we're looking at all of the red dots for just one particular cell. And so we can see that this cell likes to fire, likes to be active on this triangular grid. And we can convert that into a rate map, and we can see that this cell, again, as I said, likes to fire on a triangular grid. And there are lots and lots of other cells a bit like this, and they're called grid cells, and they're found in entorhinal cortex, part of the brain, on the side. So there's also lots of other cells that care about space in these brain areas. So for example, object vector cells. So here is a cell here that whenever the animal is to the northwest of this white object, or any of these white objects, this cell is active. So this cell is, hey, I'm at the northwest of this object. That's what it cares about. And this cell is, hey, I'm west of the object, because it always fires west of the object. You also find cells that care about borders as well. So for example, this is a cell that always cares about the border to the left, and this is a cell that always cares about the border to the bottom. So you find lots and lots of these types of cells in entorhinal cortex. And in a neighbouring part of the brain called hippocampus, you also find spatially tuned cells, such as the Nobel Prize-winning place cells, which are a bit like these grid cells, but they, rather than firing on a triangular grid, they just fire in one particular location. Or these landmark cells, which are a bit like the object vector cells, they fire vector relationships to these objects. So this one always fires when you're southeast, but it doesn't fire to every object, only to a subset. So there's a whole sort of plethora of cells, spatially selective cells, that are important in representing a cognitive map found in these brain areas. A little bit of a puzzle, though, is that these same brain areas are also critical for non-spatial coding, building non-spatial cognitive maps. So, for example, if I tell you that Alice is stronger than Bob, and Bob is stronger than Charlie, and Charlie is stronger than David, and David is stronger than Emma, and so on, and I only ever tell you each one of those pairwise, so I never tell you about Alice and David together, but if I came along and asked you who is stronger, is it David or Bob, well, you'll be able to tell me that the answer is going to be Bob, because you know that Bob was stronger than Charlie, and Charlie was stronger than David. Because you're able to chain together these pairwise pieces of information I gave you, and you're able to chain them together into a whole map, a whole structure. So as I said, these brain areas, this ability to perform this inference, this chaining-like inference, is critically reliant on the very same brain areas. So if you lesion these brain areas, as animals, they can still answer the exact same pairs that you told them. So that's this line here, this point here. But they're unable to make these inferences, these chaining inferences that they've never seen before. So they can still memorize things, but they can't infer, i.e. take a shortcut. And it's also the case that the same spatial-like cells that we saw before seem to do similar things in non-spatial problems. So for example, if you ask a rodent to hold a lever until a certain sound frequency appears, that of course has nothing to do with space, it's only to do with sound frequency. But nevertheless, you find cells which tile sound frequency space, so here would be one cell which codes for this frequency, and here down here is another cell which codes for this higher frequency. You get these cells that code for sound frequency space in the same way that cells code for physical space. And likewise, you also find cells which have these multiple peaks, a bit like these grid cells in space as well. So another bit of a puzzle of how the same brain areas build these spatial cognitive maps and non-spatial cognitive maps. And the final puzzle piece that I want to introduce here is that it's not just this single brain area over here called hippocampus and entorhinal cortex that codes for cognitive maps. You've also got another sort of area of the brain called prefrontal cortex, it's the bit at the front of your brain, which also codes for these cognitive maps, but it does so in a seemingly different way. I'm not going to overload your minds at the moment and tell you exactly how it's working, but there's just one important point that I want to get across right now. And that's that there's the difference in how these brain areas seem to code for these cognitive maps is that the brain area over here, these cells at any one moment, they just tell you about the right here and right now. Whereas in the front of the brain, these cells are telling you about both your past and future, what your past and future will be. So they seem to know about a temporal history of information, whereas these other cells just seem to know about what's going on right now. So I'm just going to summarize these puzzles that we've got, the ones that we're going to try to understand today. So the first one is, how does the same system do space and non-space? How can brains actually go about learning these maps? Why do these neurons look the way they do? And lastly, how do we have two different brain regions that solve the same problem but in different ways? So we're really trying to understand the neural mechanisms of how these cognitive maps take place. Okay, so we're going to start with, how does the same system do space and non-space? And I guess as a high level, I'm going to do a bit of introduction to, I guess, the state of the art of the field and then I'll introduce a little bit of my own work later on. So this is the sort of problem that we're interested in, the sort of relational problem we're interested in. So if I tell you that Bob is Alice's brother and Jane is Alice's child, I've only told you 2 pieces of information there. But you can fill in an awful lot more. So for example, you now know that Bob is Jane's uncle. And that's, I didn't tell you that, but you can infer that. And that's a bit like a shortcut in space, but you've now taken a shortcut in this conceptual family tree. And you could do that because you know information like parent plus brother is the same thing as uncle. It's information that you can use to help you make that inference. So knowing the family relationships for one family isn't the only thing we're interested in. So also interested in applying those relationships to other families. So if you're able to abstract away the idea of a family, the notion of a family, the notion of those relationships, you can apply them to any new family and allow you to make inferences in that new situation. And so that's the sort of thing that we're going to try to work out how to do. And of course, this same formalism of relationships amongst entities is true whether it be for families here or whether it be for space. I apologize, I should have put Paris in there now. But the only difference between these situations is the ways in which these relationships add up with each other. For space, they add up according to the rules of space, but for families, they add up according to the rules of families. But the higher level idea of a set of objects or entities with relationships between them, that's still the same thing, and that's what brings together spatial and non-spatial understanding. So if we want to get really serious about this, we can begin to try to formalize that idea of entities with relationships between them. And this is all going to sound really quite abstract to begin with, but I promise you that formalization is going to end up really telling us something quite deep about the brain. And again, I'm not going to go into any real whizzy details about this, but I'm just going to try to give you an idea of what's going on. So the idea is to formalize this with these graphs, okay? So we're going to forget for now about things about families and parents and Jane and Bob and so on. We're just going to think about this abstract idea of a thing which is connected in a certain way to other things. And so this is called a graph, and we can summarize a graph by its matrix of connectivities. So this says, well, we can see that number 1 here is connected to number 2 and number 5, and we can see that number 1 here is connected to number 2 and to number 5. Okay, so we're just saying, who am I and who are you connected to? And so for example, over here it says, if we're in number 6, well, over here, so we see 6 is connected to 5, 2, 7, and 10. Well, 6 over here is connected to, well, 2, 5, 7, and 10. So if I'm at number 6, where can I go next? And so this is quite an interesting matrix to know, because if I start in a particular state, so let's say I start in state 1, I can then apply this matrix and it'll tell me where am I likely to be in the future. So if I'm at 1, I'm likely to be at 2 and 5 after 1 step. And after 2 steps, where am I likely to be? Well, might go back to 1, to 3, to 6, to 9. So this is what this matrix summarizes what I can do after every step. Again, all very abstract, but it will come to something useful in a moment. So this matrix says, where will I likely be in 1 step's time? But there's another particularly useful matrix, which has ended up being quite useful in neuroscience, is that rather than just looking at where we're going to be in 1 time step, if we add up all of these terms, where will I be in 0 time steps, 1 time steps, 2 time steps, 3 time steps, and so on, we'll get a matrix which says, what are all of my likely futures? Like over a long or infinite time horizon, where am I likely to be? And so we can see that if we started off in 1, we're pretty likely to end up in 1, but we might go to 2 and 5, and we might end up to 9 and 13, but we sort of have our future ahead of us. And again, for mathematical people, often you discount it just so this sum actually converges. Okay, as I said, all very abstract. How does this relate to neuroscience? Okay, so if we get one of these matrices that I saw before, but now I'm doing it for a much bigger world. I'm not just doing it for 16 states, but maybe there's a few hundred states here, but connected just like spaces again. What happens if we come along and we look, right, if I'm at state number, maybe this is 50, who knows? If I'm at number 50, where am I likely going to be? Will I be in state 40, 30, 20, and so on? And we can just take this column of this matrix and we can map it back onto space. And we can see that this cell, when I've mapped this column back onto space, it says, right, if I'm at state 50, I'm likely to be in 50, but a little bit to the surrounding states, and even less to the surrounding states, and so on. But the point is, this is ending up looking a lot like a place cell, one of these place cells that we saw before. So there's some curious interaction between what this matrix looks like and what place cells look like. Okay, so that's the first sort of interesting thing there. It's also the case that if we take the people who remember maths from school, if you take the eigenvector of this matrix, that ends up looking, which is just an efficient representation of this matrix, it ends up really looking like grid cells. So if we took the eigenvectors of a square matrix, it looked like square cells. We get this sort of periodic firing in all sorts of different types of situations. And likewise, if you do it likewise, if you record from rodents as they're running around this kind of funky, fragmented hairpin maze, so this is where it's really just one big winding snake, then you find these, what was a grid cell, this beautiful triangular lattice in space, becomes really fragmented. It becomes this sort of oddly looking thing which no longer looks like a grid cell. However, if you look at this very same matrix, it sort of it carries over those same properties. Okay? So we seem to have found some interesting mapping between just representing the connectivity structures seems to have some interesting relationship to what cells actually look like. And because this accounts for non-spatial situations as well, I mean the graphs don't have to be spatial, they could be of family trees, they could be anything. The same high-level concept applies to those situations as well. So for example, if we now take a graph which consists of these three clusters, and we can show participants a sequence of objects, where each object is associated with one of these nodes. So you can see here's an object associated with this node, an object associated with this node, where the objects are their images, and the images are just randomly assigned. But we're going to show a sequence of these images to participants in a scanner, where unbeknownst to the participant, that sequence will be as if they are walking around on this graph. Okay? So they'll see a particular sequence as if they're really walking around on the graph. And then we can come along and we can take a record from the patient's brain using fMRI, and then we can look at the representation of each image. And we can see, we've compressed this down to just 2 dimensions now, but we can see that participants in this brain, in this hippocampal area, that hippocampus seems to code for these images, even though visually they're just random, there's no relationship amongst nodes visually, it nevertheless seems to encode the structure of the task in this brain area. Okay? So i.e., images that were on the orange group happen to be next to each other, images that are on the purple group happen to be next to each other, and so on. And of course, if we were to just take this arbitrary graph-like successor representation model, that predicts exactly the same thing, because what's my likely future from here? I'm most likely to visit these states, and my likely future from here, I'm most likely to visit these states. So you naturally get this clustering in this model as well. Okay, well, we've actually understood really quite a lot already. We've just taken some abstract idea of relationships and relational structures, and we've discovered that already can tell us quite a lot about the brain. It's told us that these brain representations, that's what they care about. They care about relationships. And so we've really have learnt a lot already. However, there's a few things that don't quite apply to this, to the brain from this model, is that the brain really uses neurons, and it learns from sequential experience. It doesn't just have some random graph, it has to really learn these things somehow. And so that's what we'll try to come on to now. How does the brain go about learning these maps? And how does it learn it from sequences? Well, we know that recurrent neural networks, for example, are particularly good at learning from sequences. And that's really been the dominant view of how these brain areas actually learn with recurrent neural networks. So what do we need? Well, in physical space, we might start at some location and go east, south, west, and north. And that just means we need, in our neural population, in our recurrent neural network, we need it to have trajectories that follow, that also go in loops. So they sort of mimic the outside world in their own internal representations, just like an internal model. So a little bit more precise, we might see a sequence that goes 0, 1, east, 1, 1, south, and so on. So spatial representation east, and just follow that spatial representation around. So we might see that. That means that we need some neural representation, which also, as we go from 0, 1 in a loop back to 0, 1, our neural representation, whatever some activity of neurons, also changes, but comes back to what it was in the beginning as well. And this is a sort of bread and butter problem for recurrent neural networks. And so this is a network of neurons which are all connected to each other, which receive some inputs, which will be these actions like east, south, north, and west, and so on. And it needs to make predictions of where do I think I'm going to be in space. So right, if I'm currently at 1, 1 and I go south, where will I be? So this is what the task given to these networks. And for those who like maths, this is a sort of equation that gets updated. That's the only equation that will be in here. And so if you come along and you just train one of these neural networks to predict where will I be in space at every time step, predict these sequences of where will I be in space, you really do discover things that look like grid cells. In fact, I've lied to you already, but this is actually a hand-tuned network, so where we've come along and hand-tuned what these connectivity strengths should be, the connectivity strengths in the network. But if you really do learn them, then you do learn cells that look like grid cells as well. So again, we're saying that these cells, as we know, they really care about relationships in space. And one way to train these relationships, build these relationships into your map, to learn a map, is to learn using recurrent neural networks where you're trying to predict the future. Okay? So that's what we sort of learned here. By predicting the future using sequences, that's a way of learning these maps. Okay, so that's, again, an interesting piece of information. But I want to just say that these sequences, these sort of sequences where you start at 0, 1, go east to 1, 1, that is nothing like what you and I experience in our lives. There's no one veridically telling us you are at this location, and now you're at this location, and so on. What we experience is the sensory world around us, and we have to experience those sequences of sensory experiences, and we somehow have to build a map out of that, build an understanding of the world from observations, from visual observations and so on, as opposed to someone coming along and saying, right, you're here at this location. So the brain sees sequences of observations. So this is the sort of problem that a brain will have to face. Right, you've got this stream of sensory stimuli and relations. So maybe you have, you go from light bulb and you go right to broom and down, motorbike and up and so on. So you have this stream of observations, and then you need to, and then you're tasked with predicting what comes next. So that, I should say, sorry, that sounds like quite a difficult problem. See a bunch of observations, what observation comes next? Sounds like a hard problem, but it becomes an awful lot easier if you really do have one of these maps stored somewhere in your brain. Because if you have that map stored in your brain, then you can place each object down on the map, and when you get to banana at the end of the sequence, and I've asked you what happens when you go up, you'll be able to tell me that it's going to be the light bulb, because you remembered when I was last at that location, I saw a light bulb. And again, this exact same idea of having these sequences of observations works not just in a spatial situation, but it also works if you're on something like a family tree situation. It's just that the map that you need to learn to allow you to make these predictions isn't a spatial map, it's now a family tree map. And it really is the case that in order to make these predictions, and that's like these inferences, these shortcuts, in order to make them, the only way you can do it is by having some representation, by having some cognitive map. So the point that I'm trying to get across here is that if I give you sequences and I ask you to always predict what comes next, you will have to build these maps. You don't have an option. If you want to perform well, you will have to build the map. Okay. So there's a few more things, though, that we need to think about to make this overall system work. So this is our task that we've got. And we've already discovered that what we need is to have some representation of where we are in this task. So we need to represent location in the same way that grid cells, etc., might represent location. We need to know where we are. Are we at the father, the mother, the grandparents, and so on? Then we also need to represent objects in the world. So we need to represent these two things, but critically we need to be able to bind them together so that we can understand any one particular family. So I need to have some binding operations so that I can remember who goes where in each family. So in case I need to remember the banana is the aunt of the ear in this case. And that binding process needs to be really quite flexible, because one family might be made of bananas and beds and ears, but the other family might be a family of people. And so we want this binding process to work not just for one family, but for many, many, many different families. Okay? And so again, the question is, how do we do this, and what on earth would the representations look like? Okay, so I'm just going to present a piece of work called TEM, or 10. And that really tries to solve this puzzle. It tries to solve the puzzle of how do I learn cognitive maps using these sequences of observations, the sorts of observations that you see in the real world. Okay, so it takes in an input, and it has some belief of where I am right now. So maybe it believes I'm at some location, and I'm seeing some observation. And it takes those two pieces of information, the what am I seeing and the where am I, and it binds it together. It just binds it together and just remembers it. It just stores it in a memory, okay? The particular details of that memory system aren't so important, but you can just think of it as an address book. What was here? This location, what was here? And so now, when I come along and someone tells me, you need to go and see who your sibling is, I can just update this representation in the same way that these recurrent neural networks just updated where they were. And I can keep on doing that with every new relation or action that I see. And then when I'm tasked to predict what I'm going to see next, I can just take my belief of where I'll be, so this is this neural representation, and index my memory system, and then retrieve the memory. So I can take that address location, look up in my address book, that's the person who should be there, and I can make a prediction of what I'll see. And of course, that's just a prediction, but in order to learn, again, I need to compare it to reality. So I can take this prediction and I can compare it to what do I really see in the real world, and I can learn by the errors that I've made. So in this case, I was correct, but had I been wrong, I could have used that error information, I could propagate it all the way back through this network, and then I could update my understanding of how the world works based on the errors that I make. And again, we want to do this for lots and lots of different sequences, so that we're not just learning about one family, but we're really learning the rules across every family. And the rules across every family, of course, are these abstract relational rules, the cognitive map. So does this system work? Well, if it worked, we'd be able to play games like this. We'd be able to enter this world, and see a sequence of observations. We follow this red tortuous path all the way around. And by the end of that pathway, we will have seen every object in that environment, but we would only have taken a very small subset of the relationships in that environment. Okay? But what this machine says is when you've seen all of the objects in this environment, then everything from that point onwards should be perfect prediction, because your knowledge of the relational, your knowledge of the relationships should be able to allow you to make every possible flexible inference that you haven't yet seen. So in other words, your performance in any environment should increase with the number of nodes you've seen in this graph, as opposed to the number of edges. And that's exactly what we see. The performance of these machines go up with the number of nodes you've seen, not the number of edges. And again, it's able to do this because it's seen lots and lots of examples of families or space, or lots of examples, and it's learned what the underlying structure is common to all of these families. Of course, at the beginning of learning, it's really not very good. It's really quite rubbish. So here's the blue line. It can't do anything when it's only ever seen one family before. But after a while, when it's seen lots and lots and lots of families, then it's able to make this perfect prediction. That's because it's understood what is common across all families, a family tree. Okay, so it works, but what does it actually learn? What are the map representations that this model actually learns? So again, if we look in this, in the part of the model which tries to integrate where you are, we can look what it learns, and we can see that it learns things that look a lot like grid cells. So here at the bottom are ground truth, true real grid cells recorded, and we can see this model learns representations that looks really quite grid-like. Okay, so it learns cells at different spatial frequencies, so that's also seen in grid cells. At different phases, that's also seen in grid cells, and also learns these things called band cells, which are also found in entorhinal cortex as well. And if one is to put objects in the environment, it also learns these object vector cells, just like the brain does, and border cells, just like the brain does as well. And that's, okay, so that's in this R and N part of this, the recurrent neural network part of this machine. But what about in the memory system? In this memory system, we're going to relate to hippocampus. So this model learns things that look like place cells, so little place cells and big place cells, just like little place cells and big cells in the real brain. And it also learns these landmark cells, cells that have these vector relationship towards objects, just like the real brain has these cells that have vector relationships to objects as well. Of course, this model is really a model of flexibility, of generalization. So let's look at how do these representations generalize. What do I mean by that is I'm going to take two different worlds, two different sequences with very different objects in them, and I'm going to build a map of how this machine represents this sequence. And we can see that here's just looking at one cell. We can see that it essentially represents them identically. It's just that they're shifted in the same way that real grid cells are just these shifted copies of each other in different worlds. Okay, so all I'm trying to say is that these cells have preserved their understanding of the world when they're transferring to a new situation. And that's not just true for these grid cells, it's also true for these object vector cells. It's true for all of the cells in this blue recurrent neural network. How about in this memory system, in this hippocampal memory system? Well, something interesting goes on here. So cells that fired at the top in one world will now maybe fire somewhere else. Or a big cell that fires over here in one world will also fire in some other location. And this is the phenomena that's called remapping, and it's also observed in real hippocampal cells as well. So a cell that was over here in one situation moves down here. And a cell that was over here moves over here. And there's something kind of interesting that happens. So when people had seen this before, it really looked like this remapping was random. Things moved around randomly. And it really looks random at first glance, but that we can ask the question, is it really random? Because what this model says is it says that these memory cells, this address book, the cells in here know something about where am I, and they know something about what am I seeing. So they know both these information. And because if we consider different worlds, so different worlds share the same structure, but they might have different things in them. So this is a lecture hall that is not one that I've been in before, but it's similar to other lecture halls that I've seen before. And so this makes the prediction then, because these cells know something about this blue thing, which itself knows about preserved generalizable structure, then these cells somehow should have something in them that is not random across worlds, because they're keeping some information that generalizes. Okay, so I'm going to get a little bit more precise about what I mean here. So what I mean is, if I have a cell, here's a hippocampal cell, and it's firing at this location, I'm saying that because it knows information about these grid cells, i.e. there's grid cell is telling it where it can fire, So this is a cell that fires, and it fires at the location of a grid cell in one environment. Then it should be more likely that whenever it moves, it will move to the location that is also compatible with that grid cell, i.e. this blue representation is controlling where these memory representations can be. This makes a prediction. It makes a prediction that if I look across all of pairs of place cells and grid cells in my data, then it should be the case that where this place cell remaps, there'll be a correlation in the firing of these grid cells. Okay? So what's the grid cell of firing at place cell peak in one environment versus the grid cell firing at this position of place cell firing in the other environment? There should be a correlation. And that's exactly what we observe in two data sets. And interestingly, one data set is where these animals are moving in the real world. So there's simultaneous recording of place cells and grid cells. And we observe this correlation. This is in just natural moving around in the real world. And this other data set is moving around with animals in virtual reality. So it's actually head fixed, locked on a ball, and it's running around on the ball. So it's not actually moving in space, but it's moving in virtual reality. And we can see that we find this correlation which survives a very, very hefty statistical test. So all of this is saying that these place cells do not actually randomly remap, as was previously thought. Okay, so the sorts of tasks that we've considered so far using this model that is able to learn from sequences and generalize, they've all been kind of simple, just in space. So what happens if we represent things a little bit more complicated? So here's a task where an animal now is trained to run up and go left, and then run up and go right, and run up and go left, right. So it goes left and right, then left and right, then left and right, and so on. And what does this model say? It says, right, well, because you're in space, you're going to need things which know about space, like these place cells. But there's also something else that you need to predict in the world, and that's the fact that you go left and right, then left and right. So therefore, you should have cells when you're in the middle bit, even though you're in space, they should be able to remember whether you've just gone left or whether you've just gone right. So i.e., I should have a cell which, maybe let's look at this one, it doesn't fire on this central arm if I've just gone left, but it does fire if I've just gone right. It distinguishes between whether I'm going to go left and whether I'm going to go right. Because I need to not only predict the future consequences of space, but I also need to predict the future consequences of whether I'm going left and right. So we need some simultaneous representation of where I'm in space and where I'm in task. And that's exactly what's observed in the brain. So they do find place cells, I haven't written them, put them here. But they also find cells which distinguish whether this is a left-turning cell. So it fires when I'm going left, doesn't fire when I'm going right. Here's a right-turning cell, fires when I'm going right, doesn't fire when I'm turning left. And this is true in a whole variety of different tasks which have this same structure of you're in space, but you're doing a task in space. So here's a task where I'm going out, then in, then out, then in, then out, then in, then out, then in, and so on. And the prediction is you should have cells that care about space, cells that care about whether you're going out and in, whether you're going left and right. And that's exactly what's also found. And it's also found in a more complicated task along those lines as well. Okay. Here's another quite fun task. So here's one where the animals need to just run in laps. So it just runs laps over and over and over and over again. But something interesting, where this animal only receives a reward every 4 laps. So it goes lap, 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 reward, lap, 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 reward, and so on. So again, this model says, right, you're in space, so you should understand where you're in space. So you should have cells which fire the same every lap. But because you only receive reward every 4 laps, you should have some cells which are predictive of that. So you'll find cells which only fire maybe on the first lap, or they ramp in activity over laps. And again, that's exactly what's found in hippocampus as well. And here's just another abstract task in which there's simultaneous representation of where am I in space and how much evidence I have. Okay. So I just want to stop and pause, and we've just this one model which says, right, how do I combine information in such a way so I can generalize as flexibly as possible? Just with kind of simple principles, we've ended up explaining an awful lot of cells, both spatial and non-spatial, all by these exact same principles. Okay, so a bit of a side note, just because it was mentioned earlier, that this model that we developed, so we have this bit which says where am I, and a bit which remembers things. That actually ends up being, there's an exact mathematical analogy between these models, these things called transformer neural networks, which sound abstract, but actually that's just what ChatGPT is. So ChatGPT is just one of these big models. And so it turns out that the model that we developed in the brain turns out to be identical to, well, not identical, but very, very similar to the way in which ChatGPT works. And if you ask ChatGPT that, it also agrees. Okay, so we've come quite far, and that we've understood about space and non-space. We've understood a bit about how do we learn these maps from predicting sequences. We've understood why these neurons look the way they do. They're these optimal representations for relationships. But the thing that we haven't come across yet is how do these two different brain regions solve the same problem. So if you remember, I said, right, you've got the hippocampal formation down here, and there's cells there. They really tell you about what am I seeing in the right here, right now. Well, whereas these representations in prefrontal cortex, they know about your future and your past. So the cells at any one moment don't just know about right now, they know about what you're going to do and what you just have done. I'm going to try to unpick that a little bit. Oh, the thing that I should say, sorry, is all the models that we've got so far, they're really good at explaining this bit. They're really good at explaining this stuff. They're really bad at explaining this stuff. Okay, they cannot tell us anything about prefrontal cortex. Okay, so we're going to try to understand that now. Okay, but I want to just go into pick apart what did I say about these cells know both about the past and the future. Okay, so here's a task, and this is a task, it's a working memory task. And so we've got a monkey that looks at a screen, and the order of events go like this. A light will flash up, then another light in another location, and then a third light in another location. And then after a delay period, the monkey just needs to repeat that exact sequence. So in this case, it went 1, well, I don't know what number, okay, yeah, 1, 5, 4, and the monkey needs to repeat 1, 5, 4. And of course, the monkey isn't just trained on the sequence 1, 5, 4, it's trained on all combinations of sequences. So it could have had 3, 4, 2, and the monkey would have needed to repeat 3, 4, 2. It just needs to repeat what it's seen. And what they discover, which is a slightly complicated plot, but I'll try to explain it. They discover that in the neural representation, this is in the monkey prefrontal cortex, this is during this delay period, and the neural representation consists of these 3 different subspaces. One subspace which just cares about what was the first cue, another subspace which cares about what was the second cue, and a third subspace which just cares about what was the third cue. Okay, so I'm picking apart what would that mean for the neurons. Okay, so if we're very kind to ourselves and we don't think about subspaces and we just think about a bunch of neurons for each one of these subspaces. So we're going to have 3 sets of neurons. What does it mean? So it means that if we had sequence 1, 3, and 4, so in the delay period, there'll be the neuron that cares about number 1 would be active, the neuron that cares about number 3 would be active here, and the neuron that cares about number 4 would be active here. Okay? But all of these neurons are active simultaneously in the delay period. It's just that we have 3 neurons active, and they tell me what the sequence was. Likewise, had I seen a different sequence, like 5, 2, 6, I would have seen this neuron would have been 5, this would have been the 5th neuron would have been active here, the 2nd neuron would have been active here, and the 6th neuron would have been active here. So again, these neurons, because we're in the delay period, these neurons are keeping a memory of the past, and they're telling me what did I see, what's the sequence that I saw in the past. Okay, so we're going to try to think about how this might be going on. And of course, again, the sorts of model that might end up explaining this data will be recurrent neural networks, because these are models that have this internal memory. They store memories in neural activity. So again, we might have some input, some recurrent neural network, and we try to predict some target. And of course, I'm not the first person to make any statements about recurrent neural networks are a good model of prefrontal cortex. There's lots and lots and lots of data, lots of results that suggest that prefrontal cortex is well explained by recurrent neural networks. But what we're going to try to do now is we're going to really try to understand the mechanism for what these networks are doing. So rather than just saying, hey, I've got some network and it maps to brain data, we're going to really try to understand a way in which you might be happy to tell your friend how do these networks work? How do these models work? Okay, so let's have a think about how it might work. Okay. So let's have a task, and the task is that we're just on a little loop like this, and so we might see the bed and the ear and the banana. And of course, we might not just see that particular loop of the bed, banana, and the ear, but we might see another loop which has different people or different observations at each node. Okay, and let's think about how a system might solve this. Okay, so I'm going to partition, just like how we saw in the data before, it consisted of those 3 subspaces. I'm going to come along and I'm going to partition my network representation into these 3 blocks, and I'm going to call them a slot. And let's think about how this might work, how this might solve this problem of always predicting what comes next. Okay, so let's say we're at this ear, and we're going to receive some input, and this is the ear input, and we're going to load this into the first slot. And then when we move to the bed, what we're going to do is we're going to take this slot, and we're just going to, whatever's in there, we're going to shuffle it around to this one. And now we're at the bed, so we receive the input, you're at the bed, and we load that into the first slot. And then when we move in the real world, we just shuffle all of these representations around. So what was in here goes here, what was in here goes here. So now we see the banana, and we just load that information in again. Okay. So far we've always been moving in the same direction, but what happens if we move backwards? Well, all we do is we just shuffle everything in the opposite direction as well. Okay. So I hope this is clear. This is a way in which this network could quite easily solve this task. You just load in information and you just shuffle them around, shuffle them around, shuffle them around, and shuffle it around according to the direction that you're going. Of course, this works not just in a one-dimensional system like that loop, but also if you're in a two-dimensional graph, so you're moving around in 2D. But now you won't just shuffle in loops the whole time. You might load in the information, and if we go up, we'll shuffle it up. If we go right, we then shuffle them to the right. So we load in information, we go up again, we shuffle them up, and so on. Okay, so it's just some process of all we do is we take our input, load it into one of these slots, and then we just copy and shift these around. We always just shuffle this stuff, shuffle this stuff. Okay, so these things will never interfere with each other as long as we're just copying and shifting, and so on. And that's going to allow us to make predictions because we've got all of the information and we just shuffle it around so we're able to predict stuff. Okay, so that's like a plausible model for how a neural network, how a recurrent neural network can solve all of the same tasks that we saw earlier. And of course, the question is that actually what's going on when for recurrent neural networks, do they actually learn this? So first, we should probably make sure that if we train a recurrent neural network on these tasks, they can actually solve the tasks. And we can see that here's just an example task. We can see that these networks are able to solve it. And if you're a bigger network, you can solve harder problems. So it's like how big the problem is. So here there's 5 things to remember, but over here there'll be 30 things to remember and so on. So the bigger networks can solve bigger problems. And it's true for a whole variety of these tasks. Bigger networks can solve the bigger problems, but all of them can at least solve some of the problems. Okay, so they all work. The question is, are they actually learning this situation where they have these structured slots to them? Okay, so if they were, then for this very simple 3-loop task, as I saw, it should learn a structure that looks something like this, or at least has properties like this. And we can try to detect that we just train a randomly initialized neural network, totally randomly initialized. And then this model here, this slot model, makes a very particular prediction of what we should be able to decode from each slot at any time step, in any situation, in any task. Okay. So it makes a very particular prediction, and we can just decode that prediction from the trained neural network. And what we see in the blue line is the prediction from this model, and the orange line is a prediction from a competing other possible model. Okay? And so the point I'm trying to get across here is that this network really has learned this slot representation. And here's an example. This is an example in 1D. In 2D, we're saying it should learn something that looks like this. and it really does learn this. This network really learns subspaces, and where each subspace corresponds to one of these things. Okay, so these neural networks really are learning these slots, and so we have some mechanistic understanding of how these neural networks are working, but the question is this actually what frontal cortex is doing? Does it match data in prefrontal cortex? Okay, well, let's return to this task that we saw before, of where the monkey has to look at is shown three things, and then it has to saccade to those three things in order. And so we saw that the monkey representation consisted of these three, well, in fact, they're orthogonal subspaces. And if we train a recurrent neural network, it indeed learns exactly the same thing. It learns these three orthogonal subspaces. And again, how can we explain it? Well, we can explain that this is what's going on. All that's happening is we've got these three slots, and we put in information, and we just shuffle them around. Put in information, shuffle them around. Put in information, shuffle them around. And that's great, because now after we've seen the sequence of three things, I've got the whole representation, the whole understanding of that sequence in my representation. And to make a prediction then, I just shuffle it around one, shuffle it around one, shuffle it around one, and that tells me where to look. Okay, so it matches this data. Here's another task. And so this is an interesting task, where first, the monkey just has to fixate on the screen. Then it's showing two stimuli. One's on the top, one's on the bottom. And across different trials, these two stimuli, they're just randomly drawn. But there's always one on the top and there's one on the bottom. Then there's a delay period. And then there's a cue. And this cue tells you, should I report the one on the top or should I report the one on the bottom? So it'll be a different cue for the top versus the bottom one. And then there's a delay period, and then the monkey has to then recall whether it was the top or the bottom. And so what they find is something quite interesting. Okay, so before the cue, so in this delay period here, before the cue, they find that there's two orthogonal subspaces. There's one subspace, this subspace ends up coding for the stimuli on the bottom, and there's this other subspace which codes for the stimuli on the top. That's before the cue. Then after the cue, these subspaces become parallel to each other. Okay, so you can sort of just view it as it's just one subspace in the end. So where whatever's on the top is also parallel to whatever's on the bottom. Okay, and we can do the same thing. We can train a recurrent neural network. The images aren't quite as pretty here, but the point is the same, that we have before the cue, we have orthogonal subspaces. After the cue, these subspaces become parallel to each other. And how do we understand that with the model? Well, again, quite easily. So we've taken these two stimuli, we've made the delay, and all that's happened is right now we've got the bottom object in one slot and the top object in the other slot. And then when we come across, have the delay, so have the cue, if the cue said that the objects, so let's say, sorry, I should say that we need to read out information from one of these slots. And let's say we're always reading out information from this slot. Then if the cue said the bottom is the important one, then that's great. We just read out from the bottom slot. But if the cue said the top one was important, then we need to shuffle these round. We need to copy this one down here and this one up here. And then we can read out again from just the same slot. Okay. And so what that's ending up saying is that, sorry, I realize I haven't explained this brilliantly, but what that's ending up saying is that the cue is behaving, the cue which says top or bottom slot, is behaving like a velocity signal. It's behaving like north, east, south, and west in the other tasks, but it's really just an action. It's telling you, how should I do this shuffling process? Okay, so what this is trying to say is that this idea now of cue-dependent recall is exactly the same as navigation. Okay, so it's sort of a somewhat both trivial but kind of deep point that's being made here. Okay. And the last thing I'm going to show is that this idea of these slots also makes quite novel predictions that we tested ourselves in prefrontal data. Okay, so this is a task where you have to do, where you go A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, and where the A, Bs, and C, Ds could be anything, but across different trials there'll be different things, but the idea of going A, B, C, D is always the same. But between each A and B there's a delay. And the delays for each trial are the same, but for across different tasks they're different. So here's an example of if these A's and B's could be colors. So we might go red, so that's A, green, green, blue, but with these different delays. So here's a long delay, short delay, middle delay. Okay, so we've gone red, green, green, blue, that's A, B, C, D, and then red, green, green, blue, that's also A, B, C, D. But critically, the delays are the same in this task between each A and B. So A and B is long delay, short delay, and repeat. So A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D. Red, green, green, blue, red, green, green, blue, and so on. That'd be one example. Another example might be green, short delay, red, short delay, blue, long delay, green, and then we're on repeat again. Okay, so different trials have different ABCDs, and they have different delays, but each one is sort of consistent within the trial. Okay, so what would this slot model says? Well, it says something kind of interesting. It says, right, now you need to have slots. Before, we have only had 4 slots, 1 slot for each point in the task. But now it says you need lots of slots. And you need lots of slots because you've got these varying delay periods. Okay? I've just put 1 extra one in here, just for visualization purposes. But now information will enter into the first slot, and then it will just slowly progress around. It will slowly progress around, and then come back. So let's look at what this model says about a particular neuron. Let's look at this neuron. Let's say that this neuron is the neuron which cares about a green piece of information, and it cares about a green piece of information 50% of this time period. The 50% of the time period. Sorry, it cares about a green object 50% of the time period after that green object was presented. Okay. So what's this cell tell about this cell? Right, first it says, well, if no green object is presented, it's not going to be active at all. If the green object is at this A, then this cell is going to be active 50% after the green object when it's presented at this location, at this point. If the green object is presented here, then this cell is going to be 50% active after this point. If the green object was presented here, it will be 50% after this point, and so on. Okay? So this is a cell which always occurs 50% after I've seen something, after the green thing, but in any task it could be, it could be clocked around a little bit different, depending on whether the green object was at A, B, C, or D. Likewise, let's look at this cell, which says I'm not going to be 50% after, I'm going to be 350% after I see something purple. Okay, so here, if the purple thing happened at A, then this will be 350% after that purple thing. Or if the purple thing happened at B, it'll be 350% after that purple thing. If it happened at C, it'll be 350. D happened at 350 as well. Okay. So let's just try to give an understanding. These cells care about what object I saw, and how far away am I from that object. And indeed, we find exactly those cells in medial prefrontal cortex. So here's a cell which always fires when you're 50% after a purple thing, wherever the purple thing happens. So if the purple thing was at B, 50% after it. If it was D, 50% after it. So we find exactly those sorts of cells in medial frontal cortex. And we also find, so the model, actually, when you train a recurrent neural network on this task, it also predicts there's this other kind of weird cell, which all it does is it tracks progress through. So it looks like a 4-leaf clover, as opposed to just having one leaf to it. And again, in frontal cortex, we also find exactly that. Okay, there's one last thing I want to say, and you'll just have to trust me on this one. It turns out that these 2 models that we presented, one that cares about the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex, and one that is about the prefrontal cortex, it turns out that actually, in a computational sense, they're identical. And of course that makes sense because they solve the same task. But it turns out that you can mathematically show that they are exactly the same thing. But the only difference is that this model stores memories in synaptic connections, like in hippocampal synaptic connections, whereas this model stores memories in neural activity. And you can write down the equation for one, the equation for the other, and you can show that they're totally equivalent. Okay, so a duality between these 2 brain areas, storing memory in activity versus memory in neural connections. Okay, So let's just summarize. Okay, so how does the same system do space and non-space? Well, we've unified it with this graph-like framework. It's just the idea of relationships in the world. It doesn't matter if they're spatial or family. So how do brains learn these maps? Well, we've shown an example of a model, and really it's this idea of recurrence and this prediction of observations. And if you try to predict optimally, you just have to learn a map. You have no other option. So why do the neurons look the way they do? Well, it turns out these neurons are the optimal representation for representing relationships. And lastly, how do these different brain regions solve the same problem in different ways? Well, we presented these two competing model formulations, and this one ends up being able to predict a lot of cells in hippocampal formation, and this one ends up being able to predict a lot of cells in frontal cortex. And we've shown that those two things are actually have a deep duality to them as well. And with that, I just want to say thank you to everyone I work with, and thank you to you guys for listening.